6:47 a.m., November 18th, 2025, Seattle, Washington. 14 federal vehicles turned off East Marginal Way South at the same time, headlights cutting through the gray waterfront fog. No sirens. No radio chatter. Each driver had been briefed to stay off the radio until the primary signal. Estimated value of sanctioned oil concealed inside those invoices, $280 million. The convoy split into 4 columns at the intersection near Terminal 46. OFAC enforcement officers, FBI Seattle field agents, and CBP tactical units had been staged since 4:30 a.m. 17 target locations across the Port Industrial District. 1 coordinated entry time, 6 minutes from now. Inside a nondescript federal building, 3 blocks east, a 34-year-old customs entry specialist named David Choi was watching the operation unfold on a logistics terminal screen. The same screen where, 8 weeks earlier, he had noticed something that shouldn't have been mathematically possible. The story of how 17 apparently legitimate import firms, each with valid broker bonds, clean compliance histories, and years of processed shipments, became the financial backbone of a $280 million Iranian crude oil laundering operation does not begin with a wiretap, a confidential informant, or a grand jury subpoena. It begins with a weight discrepancy. 3 of them, actually, filed on the same day, referencing the same vessel arrival by 3 companies that had no documented relationship with each other. That detail will matter. Hold on to it. Seattle's port industrial corridor along the Duwamish waterfront had been a legitimate hub for Pacific Rim timber trade since the 1990s. Canadian softwood from British Columbia, Douglas fir, western red cedar, hemlock, moved through the port in standardized containers, routed primarily to construction material distributors serving the Pacific Northwest building sector. The trade was predictable. The documentation was formulaic. CBP inspectors processed hundreds of lumber manifests per week, and the statistical fingerprint of the trade was well established. That predictability was the architecture the scheme depended on. Between December 2023 and November 2025, 17 import companies operating in Seattle's Port District had collectively filed 2,847 separate CBP entries for softwood lumber shipments originating from Canadian exporters in British Columbia. Each company maintained valid customs bonds. Each carried EPA wood treatment certifications. Each had clean audit histories with no prior enforcement actions. On paper, they looked like the most boring set of businesses in the Pacific Northwest. The financial reality was different. The companies were not importing Canadian lumber. They were laundering Iranian crude oil, petroleum purchased through shadow fleet intermediaries in the Gulf of Oman, transshipped through UAE ports, and rebilled through a layered invoice structure designed to make oil revenue look like softwood timber receipts. The crude had been pumped, the ships had sailed, the tankers had unloaded. But what crossed the ledger at 17 Seattle-registered import firms was a paper fiction, container after container of Canadian spruce, pine, and fir that never existed. The scheme worked because it exploited a specific gap in U.S. trade enforcement. CBP's primary inspection burden at timber importing ports focuses on biological compliance, wood treatment certifications, bark beetle containment, phytosanitary documentation. Not financial forensics. The AML scrutiny that applies to financial institutions does not apply to freight brokers in the same way. The banking side of these transactions ran through correspondent accounts at domestic institutions, but the underlying commodity invoices looked legitimate to any analyst who wasn't specifically looking for statistical anomalies across multiple unrelated accounts. The network's architects understood this. They had designed the scheme around exactly this gap, and for 23 months, it worked. David Choi joined CBP's Seattle field office in January 2022 as an entry specialist assigned to the Pacific Rim Timber and Building Materials Desk. The role was largely administrative, reviewing manifest documentation, cross-referencing tariff classifications, flagging biological compliance issues for physical inspection teams. It was not, by design, a financial intelligence position. Choi's background was in data systems. Before CBP, he had spent 3 years at a logistics software firm in Bellevue writing data validation tools for supply chain management platforms. He thought in patterns. He thought in distributions. On the morning of September 9th, 2025, Choi was processing a batch of manifest reviews for the previous week's vessel arrivals. The MV Cascade Meridian, a bulk carrier registered in the Marshall Islands, had arrived at Terminal 30 on September 4th. 3 separate import companies had filed container weight declarations for softwood lumber consignments off that vessel: Pacifica Timber Solutions, LLC, Northwest Materials Import Group, and Pacific Rim Building Supply, Inc. Choi noticed that the declared container weights for all 3 consignments were identical, to the kilogram, not approximately similar. identical. Container after container, across 3 separate companies, 3 separate declared BC exporters, 3 separate invoice chains. He ran a query back 60 days. The same pattern appeared on 4 additional vessel arrivals. Identical weight declarations across firms with no common ownership, no disclosed common carrier arrangement, and no business reason to be filing matching documentation. The probability of that occurring by chance in legitimate independent trading operations was, by any actuarial standard, essentially 0. Choi escalated to CBP's Trade Analytics Unit the same afternoon. He didn't know what he had found. He wrote in his escalation memo that the data suggests either a shared documentation vendor error or an undisclosed common origin for these consignments. He flagged it as a potential administrative anomaly requiring verification. The Trade Analytics Unit would determine within 11 days that it was neither of those things. I spent time going through the initial escalation file, and one detail kept pulling at me. Choi's memo was 3 paragraphs. No alarm language, no dramatic framing. Just a note about numbers that didn't align. The case that would freeze $280 million started with the most unassuming document in the entire investigative record. CBP's Trade Analytics Unit cross-referenced the vessel IMO numbers from the 6 affected arrivals against OFAC's blocked and monitored vessel registry. OFAC had published an updated Iran Shadow Fleet advisory in February 2026, a comprehensive update to its tracked list of vessels suspected of facilitating Iranian crude oil exports in violation of U.S. sanctions. 3 of the 6 vessels matched entries in that advisory exactly: the MV Cascade Meridian, the MV Oman Passage, the MV Gulf Meridian Star. All 3 had documented port calls at UAE transshipment facilities: Fujairah, Khor Fakkan, and Sharjah, within 60 days of their Seattle arrivals. All 3 had activated AIS transponder anomalies consistent with dark sailing methodology during segments of their Gulf of Oman transit routes. All 3 carried container manifests that showed cargo originating from British Columbia. None of them had made port in British Columbia. The Trade Analytics Unit notified OFAC's Enforcement Division on September 22, 2025. OFAC forwarded the referral to FBI Seattle the same day. A joint financial investigation was authorized within 72 hours under the Iran Sanctions Enforcement Framework. The question was no longer whether the scheme existed. It was how big it was. If you've ever tried to reconstruct a financial network from correspondent banking records, imagine that process running across 34 separate accounts at 5 institutions simultaneously, with a legal clock ticking and 17 active businesses continuing to operate. That was the pressure FBI Seattle's Financial Crimes Unit was working under from the moment the investigation opened. What investigators found when they began pulling the correspondent banking records exceeded every initial projection. The 17 import companies had collectively processed $280 million in oil-backed transactions through a layered invoice structure over 23 months. The money moved through 3 primary channels. The first channel routed approximately $94 million through a Dubai-registered trading company, Al Rashid Maritime Commodities FZE, which held accounts at a UAE correspondent bank with clearing relationships to 2 of the 5 USN institutions under examination. Al Rashid had no documented history in legitimate commodity trading. Its incorporation date was November 2023. The same month, the Seattle network's first container declarations appeared in CBP's manifest database. The second channel, roughly $112 million, moved through a Vancouver-registered trust structure, Pacific Cascades Asset Trust, which held beneficial ownership interests in 17 separate numbered companies across British Columbia and Alberta. The trust's stated purpose was real estate investment. Its actual function, as investigators determined, was to layer the proceeds through a succession of property acquisition transactions that stripped the money's origin from any traceable audit trail within 4 to 6 transaction steps. The third channel was the one that pushed the investigation beyond financial crimes jurisdiction. Approximately $74 million had flowed into a Seattle-based electronics distribution company, Cascade Defense Components, Inc., registered at a light industrial address in the Soto district. Cascade Defense carried a commercial electronics import license. It also, investigators would discover, held relationships with multiple export-controlled component suppliers servicing the defense electronics sector. 7 export-controlled component categories had been purchased through Cascade Defense's procurement accounts during the same period the oil laundering network was operational. The components included dual-use integrated circuits, precision timing modules, and radio frequency shielding materials. Items on the Commerce Control List under EAR Category 3 and EAR Category 7. The investigation expanded from an OFAC sanctions enforcement matter to a parallel export control violation inquiry under the Export Administration Regulations. The Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security was notified on October 3, 2025. What strikes me about this case, looking at the full investigative timeline, is how the scheme's architects appear to have anticipated detection at the banking level and built countermeasures into the design, but didn't anticipate that the first break would come from a data pattern on a timber manifest. They over-engineered the financial layers and under-engineered the commodity documentation. That asymmetry is ultimately what brought the network down. The identity of the network's financial architect, identified in the criminal complaint as Harrison Mullen, 51, answered a question the investigation had been trying to resolve for weeks. How had the AML review processes at 5US? Correspondent banks failed to flag these transactions for 23 months. Mullen had spent 11 years as a compliance officer at Pacific Gateway Commercial Bank, a mid-sized Seattle freight and trade finance institution, before its acquisition by a larger regional bank group in 2021. During that tenure, he had written 3 of the 5 institutions' correspondent banking due diligence protocols for Pacific Rim commodity trade accounts. He had designed the frameworks that were supposed to catch schemes like this one. He had also designed them with certain specific blind spots. Blind spots he apparently planned, years in advance, to exploit. Most people assume financial crime networks are built by people who don't understand the compliance systems they're defeating. The evidence here tells a different story. Mullen didn't defeat the compliance systems from the outside. He built them from the inside, writing detection gaps into the framework while still in a position of institutional trust, then waiting 3 years after his departure to activate the network he had been quietly assembling. The court transcripts run over 800 pages, but it's a single footnote in the OFAC enforcement filing that tells the real story. Mullen's signature appears on a correspondent banking risk assessment from 2019 that specifically identified weight declaration anomalies across multi-company timber accounts as a low-priority review category. He had classified the exact detection method that would eventually expose his network as a low-risk indicator. He had seen Choi's methodology coming. He just hadn't expected someone to actually apply it. The forensic accounting reconstruction required OFAC's enforcement division to work backward through 23 months of transaction records across the 5 institutions, mapping the flow of funds from the initial oil sale points in the Gulf of Oman through the UAE transshipment layer, through the Seattle timber invoice structure, and into the 3 downstream channels: Dubai, Vancouver, and Cascade. Defense. The reconstruction took 6 weeks and consumed over 4,000 analyst hours. By early November 2025, the investigation had identified the 19 individuals who held controlling or operational roles across the 17 import companies, the Vancouver Trust Structure, and Cascade Defense. That's when the investigation hit its first significant obstacle. 7 of the 19 identified principals were not in the United States. 4 were in the UAE. 2 were in Canada. 1 was in Turkey. Coordinating simultaneous law enforcement action across 3 foreign jurisdictions while keeping an active investigation quiet, without tipping off the domestic targets, required a level of interagency coordination that pushed the operational timeline by nearly 2 weeks. FBI Seattle had to sequence the domestic arrests to a single morning window, while requesting that Canadian and UAE authorities execute parallel detention orders within a 48-hour window. One failure anywhere in that coordination would risk flight. The Canadians confirmed cooperation on November 12th. The UAE declined mutual legal assistance for reasons not disclosed in the public record. FBI proceeded with a modified plan, accepting that the 4 UAE-based principals would likely not be immediately detained. The morning of November 18th, 2025, was chosen because 3 of the 19 domestic principals, including Harrison Mullen, had booked flights departing Seattle-Tacoma International Airport that day. Mullen's ticket was to Istanbul. The 2 other principals had booked a connecting flight through Toronto to Dubai. The airport arrests were added to the operational plan 48 hours before execution. There's a line in the indictment that reads almost like fiction. Defendant Mullen purchased his departure ticket on November 14th, 2025, 3 days after the Canadian Mutual Legal Assistance confirmation was transmitted. A transmission that was later determined to have been intercepted by a third party with access to one of the 5 target institutions' internal compliance networks. The timing was not coincidental. Someone had tipped him. The investigation never definitively identified who. At 6:47 a.m., all 17 search warrant executions initiated simultaneously. The tactical elements were coordinated by FBI Seattle's Special Operations Group, with CBP tactical support units attached to 4 of the 17 locations designated as potential evidence destruction risks. OFAC enforcement officers accompanied agents at all 17 locations in an advisory capacity for the identification and preservation of trade documentation. The 17 locations ranged from registered office addresses at a shared commercial services provider in Bellevue, where several of the import companies existed only as mailboxes and filing addresses, to operational warehouses and freight handling facilities along the Duwamish waterfront and the Kent Valley Industrial Corridor. The most significant physical evidence site was the Cascade Defense Components warehouse at 3847 South Hanford Street in the Soto district. CBP tactical units entered alongside FBI at 6:47 a.m. Inside, they found 12 shipping containers of electronics components, some export-controlled, a financial record-keeping room with 6 networked servers, and a walk-in document archive containing physical invoice files dating back to December 2023. The servers were forensically preserved intact. The document archive required a specialized CBP archival team 3 days to process. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface, and it took investigators a while to reconstruct the logic. The Cascade Defense Facility maintained complete paper records of every transaction, physical copies, file folders, printed invoice chains. Why would an operation this sophisticated maintain physical records of its own financial crimes? The answer, when investigators reconstructed it, was both logical and ironic. Mullen had designed the compliance audit trail at the banking level to show legitimate timber trade, but he needed internal records of the actual oil transaction chain to manage cash flow across the network and reconcile payments to the Gulf intermediaries. The physical records were an operational necessity. He kept them because he had to, and he kept them in a location he believed was secure. The location was not secure. At Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, FBI agents from the Criminal Investigative Division made contact with Harrison Mullen at the Alaska Airlines departures gate at 6:52 a.m. He had already cleared security. The gate arrest required coordination with TSA security and Port of Seattle police. Mullen was taken into custody without resistance. He said nothing to agents at the gate. According to the arrest report, when read his Miranda rights, he replied, "I've been expecting this call for 3 years." The 2 other principals attempting departure were arrested at their connecting gate 11 minutes later. The raid was over by 9:15 a.m. 17 locations secured, 19 domestic arrests executed, 34 correspondent bank accounts frozen under emergency OFAC asset blocking orders. But what nobody in the federal building, 3 blocks from Terminal 46, was prepared for was what came in from the forensic accounting team 48 hours later, the $280 million figure, the number that had anchored the entire investigation, was conservative. The forensic reconstruction of the full transaction chain, incorporating the server data recovered from the Cascade Defense Facility, indicated that the network had processed a total of $340 million in oil-backed transactions. The additional $60 million had moved through a 4th channel that hadn't appeared in the correspondent banking analysis, a cryptocurrency conversion layer using a Monero-based mixing service that had been running in parallel with the fiat currency channels since March 2024. The cryptocurrency layer had converted approximately $60 million in oil proceeds into Monero, mixed the funds through a decentralized exchange structure, and reconverted a portion into Bitcoin before routing the holdings to 3 cold storage wallet addresses. Those wallets were identified in the server data. Their total holdings at the time of seizure, approximately $31 million in combined cryptocurrency value, based on November 2025 exchange rates. The remaining $29 million from the crypto layer had already been moved. Where and through which additional conversion steps remained an open question at the conclusion of the primary investigation. Unpopular opinion. The regulatory framework that let this run for 23 months is not a failure of enforcement. It's a structural design problem. Timber commodity invoicing and oil-backed financial instruments exist in adjacent regulatory worlds that don't communicate in real time. Mullen knew this. He wrote about it in a 2018 compliance industry paper titled Commodity Trade Finance Gaps in AML Enforcement Architecture. The paper was cited 7 times in academic literature. The gap he described in 2018 was not closed before he exploited it in 2023. Whether that failure belongs to the institutions, the regulators, or the academic community that published his roadmap without flagging its operational implications, that's a question worth sitting with. What do you think? Did the compliance system enable this, or was Mullen operating at a level of sophistication that no framework would have caught in time? Comment below. The answers we've seen from people who work in trade finance are not what you'd expect. The legal proceedings following the November 18th operation moved through multiple jurisdictional tracks simultaneously. Harrison Mullen was charged under 18 U.S.C. Section 1956 money laundering, 50 USA, Section 1705 violation of IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the statutory basis for Iran sanctions, and 50 U.S.C. Section 4819 Export Administration Regulations violations related to the Cascade Defense Component procurement. The indictment also included conspiracy charges linking Mullen to the other domestic principals. Mullen's attorney entered an initial not guilty plea at arraignment on November 21st. Bail was denied on flight risk grounds, given the Istanbul ticket and the frozen assets. He was remanded to the Federal Detention Center in SeaTac. Of the 19 domestic principals charged, 16 entered not guilty pleas at arraignment. 3 entered cooperation agreements with the government within 30 days of arrest, exchanging plea agreements in cooperation with the Financial Forensics Reconstruction for reduced charge exposure. The cooperation agreements produced significant additional intelligence on the overseas network structure, specifically the Gulf of Oman intermediary chain linking the Shadow Fleet tanker operators to the UAE transshipment layer. That intelligence was shared with Treasury's OFAC Enforcement Division and passed to U.S. partners in allied intelligence services. The Canadian proceedings against the 2 Vancouver-based principals moved through separate extradition and mutual legal assistance channels. As of the public record, available through early 2026, the extradition proceedings were active. The 4 UAE-based principals remained outside U.S. custody. OFAC issued blocking designations for all 4 under its Iran Sanctions Enforcement Authority, effectively freezing their access to the U.S. financial system, whether they faced meaningful legal consequences in the UAE, a jurisdiction that has maintained complex positioning on Iran sanctions compliance, was not established in the public record. The Vancouver Trust structure, Pacific Cascades Asset Trust, became the subject of a separate civil asset forfeiture proceeding in cooperation with Canadian authorities under the Proceeds of Crime Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Act. The trust held interests in 17 properties across BC and Alberta. 11 of those properties were frozen pending forfeiture proceedings. 6 had already been transferred to additional shell entities before the investigation concluded. The value of the 6 transferred properties, estimated at $43 million based on assessed values, remained unrecovered. The Al Rashid Maritime Commodities account in Dubai was subject to an OFAC blocking designation. UAE financial authorities were requested to cooperate in freezing the account. The funds held in that account at the time of the request, approximately $22 million, were not recovered. UAE financial authorities confirmed the account had been closed and funds transferred before the blocking action was implemented domestically. The cryptocurrency wallets identified in the server data were partially recovered. Of the $31 million in estimated holdings, approximately $18 million in Bitcoin had been converted back to fiat through a licensed exchange that cooperated with the government's seizure order. The remaining holdings, approximately $13 million in Monero, were technically unrecoverable due to the structural anonymity properties of the Monero protocol. They remain unaccounted for. One detail that stuck with me, reviewing the full case record, is the surveillance log entry from October 14th, 2025, 5 weeks before the raid, during the active investigation phase. FBI surveillance teams had been monitoring Harrison Mullen's personal movements since early October, following the expansion of the investigative scope to include Cascade Defense. On October 14th, at 2:23 p.m., Mullen is recorded entering a coffee shop on Pike Street near the Pike Place Market. He ordered a coffee. He sat for 47 minutes. He made no phone calls. He met no one. The surveillance log notes, subject appeared to spend approximately 45 minutes reading. No contacts observed. No suspicious behavior. 45 minutes reading in a coffee shop. No calls, no meetings. At that point, Mullen, based on the later server data, knew the investigation was likely in progress. He had been tipped by someone inside the institutional network. He was 2 weeks from trying to board a flight to Istanbul. The case never resolved who tipped him. The 3 cooperation agreement witnesses either didn't know or claimed they didn't know. The server data contained encrypted communications referencing an unnamed source with access to one of the target institution's compliance monitoring systems. That source was never identified. If you've been following cases in this space, drop a comment YES if you think the compliance insider tip is the most important unresolved thread in this case. Or no if you think the $29 million in untraced crypto is the bigger open question. We read every comment. The BIS export control investigation into Cascade Defense's procurement of controlled electronics components produced its own parallel findings. Of the 7 export-controlled component categories identified in the procurement records, investigators determined that 4 had been acquired in quantities exceeding any plausible commercial electronics resale market justification. The components, specifically the precision timing modules and certain RF shielding configurations, were consistent with guidance systems applications. The end-use declarations on the procurement orders specified commercial audiovisual equipment repair. The discrepancy was referred to the Department of Justice's National Security Division. Whether any of the Cascade defense components had been exported, and to whom, was still under active investigation at the time the public record was last updated. The full scope of the export control violation, and whether the components had ultimately reached any foreign military or dual-use program, remained an open question. This is the part of the case the sentencing headlines won't capture. Harrison Mullen pled guilty to money laundering and IEEPA violations on February 14, 2026, under a cooperation agreement that included full financial disclosure and assistance with the ongoing export control investigation. Sentencing was scheduled for the spring of 2026. Under the plea terms, the government agreed to recommend a sentence of 18 to 22 years, significantly below the statutory maximum exposure for the combined charges. 11 of the 16 remaining defendants entered plea agreements over the following 3 months. 5 proceeded to trial. As of the most recent publicly available record, the trial proceedings were ongoing. Total assets seized, frozen, or forfeited across the operation, approximately $247 million, against the $340 million total the forensic reconstruction established. The gap between those numbers, approximately $93 million, represents funds that moved through channels the investigation could identify but could not practically reach before they were transferred beyond U.S. jurisdictional access. The network is dismantled. The principals are charged. The oil invoices no longer move. The $93 million gap between what was laundered and what was recovered will not appear in the press release. The 4 UAE-based principals are not in custody. The compliance insider who tipped Mullen about the investigation has never been identified. The server data showed the network had been in active expansion mode. New import company registrations, new correspondent banking relationships. As recently as October 2025, suggesting the $340 million figure itself may represent only a segment of a larger operational structure that was still being built when the investigation closed it down. The structural gap Mullen described in his 2018 paper, the space between commodity trade finance and AML enforcement, has been partially addressed in response to this case. OFAC published updated guidance in January 2026, expanding the flag criteria for weight declaration anomalies in timber and building material commodity accounts. CBP's Trade Analytics Unit received additional staff and cross-referencing authority in the fiscal year 2026 budget. The specific detection method David Choi applied, the one that started everything, is now a formal review protocol. What that 2026 guidance doesn't address is the next version of the scheme, the one that uses a commodity category no one has statistically mapped yet. The one being designed right now by someone who reads compliance advisory updates the way a chess player reads their opponent's previous games. The demand for sanctioned oil doesn't disappear because one network is seized. The infrastructure for building the next scheme, offshore corporate registries, UAE transshipment facilities, cryptocurrency conversion layers, compliance systems with exploitable gaps. None of that was dismantled on November 18, 2025. David Choi noticed a number. 3 identical numbers, actually. That's where it ended. And that's exactly where the next version of it will start again, in some other column of some other manifest, waiting for someone to be paying close enough attention. If you want to see how these networks reconstruct after federal seizure operations, what happens to the personnel, the methodology, and the financial architecture when a network like this one gets hit, subscribe. The follow-on cases to operations of this scale are where the architecture becomes visible. You won't want to miss that.